Hello and welcome to another LSA CPD. I'm Jason Sir. For those of you who don't know, the way this all works is that we try to give conversations and discussion equal billing to the talks we have. So we will have a short talk of around 30 minutes and there'll be 30 minutes left for questions, discussion, conversation. So any questions you do have, as they formulate in your head while the CPD is taking place, if you put them in the chat at the bottom, I can read them out. Or if you're feeling really confident, you can unmute yourself and speak away. Today, I'm really excited to say that we have Tahera and Tony from RCKa, and they're going to be talking about how to unlock social value from a project. The talk will kind of discuss how to listen. I will outline how to listen and kind of learn from stakeholders, empowering them to have a meaningful impact on their environment. Tony and Tahera will then take us through a few case studies, which will look at supporting local people on a journey to secure a viable long-term community hub, creating homes and spaces which combat social isolation in the elderly, and reimagining the unsustainable business park model to create a complex mixed use and user ecosystem. Bit of a mouthful there. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tahera and Tony, and I'll let them take the stage. Thank you, Tahera and Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, everyone. Right, I will share my screen. Hopefully that all works effectively.
Perfect. Thanks, Tony.
Okay.
So my name is Tahera Rouf, and Tony has also introduced himself. We're both associates at RCKa. So today's PBD is entitled How to Unlock Social Value from the Project. Our work, before Tony goes into it a little bit more, is very much about creating socially responsive architecture that balances value for our communities and clients. And our work ranges from housing, community building, master planning, workspaces, education. But I'll hand over Tony to the next bit.
Yeah, so this talk's all about sort of how to unlock social value from a project. And as Jason said, really, this is a sort of area we do a lot of thinking around. We're aware that a lot of architects are also doing a lot of thinking around that. So we're quite keen to sort of hear your thoughts at the end of this talk. So we're going to kind of sort of put some questions to you at the end. We're aware that there's a lot of discussion about what does social value mean. Obviously, there was the 2013 Social Value Act that sort of defined it as wider sort of social, economic and environmental benefits. We like to think of it in terms of sort of people, place, planet, which is just really a sort of another way of talking about those different categories. But I think trying to define social value, trying to evidence its worth, and trying to make sure it's embedded in projects and clients are on board with the benefits of it is a sort of is the key thing we're grappling with at the moment that we're going to discuss with you. So we're going to go through sort of 3 case study projects that touch on different aspects: the first, people; the second, place; the third, planet. Just to sort of give you a little thought about ourselves and why Tahera and I particularly are talking about this, where our interest stems from. I mean, personally, I'm really interested in the role of the architect as a sort of professional generalist, someone who kind of understands the building process and has sort of a creative ability to solve problems, but might not be an expert on any one subject. But I think that's quite empowering, that sort of professional generalist role. And what I really enjoy about that is deploying that knowledge, deploying that sort of middle person knowledge to support people to have a positive impact on their built environment. So where a local community wants to make something happen, wants to improve their place, you know, I think we're really well placed to deploy our knowledge to empower and support them to do that. Tahera, sort of your thoughts.
Yeah, and similarly, I think aside from that, I think it's really important that we bring our real life experiences to our work. And I think it's fair to say that all of us and everyone sort of listening in today is that we live and work and are part of communities. And individually for us, it's important to have a voice in our community to say what it looks like, forge how it should be. So I think alongside being those facilitators, we like to think that bringing our lived experience to the work is also equally as important.
Cool. So we'll go through three little case studies. I'll take the first, Tahera the second, and then I'll come back on the third. So the first one I want to talk to you about is the smallest scale of these projects. It's a meanwhile project called the Granville. Some of you may be aware of. It's in Brent in South Kilburn. I mean, this project is about the meanwhile refurbishment of an existing building. But it was really also about this journey we went on with the local people in South Kilburn. And it was about understanding the changes that are going on in that community and what local people needed to sort of support their dreams, support their ambitions, and make sure they sort of continue to recognize and feel part of their community. There's an enormous amount of change going on in South Kilburn. There's been various layers of change really sort of throughout the 20th century and now, with a lot of the sort of 1950s, 1960s housing stock now being replaced by sort of newer buildings. And the Granville was this building, which is the sort of last remaining building from the kind of 19th century development of South Kilburn that people felt quite attached to. But more than the building, it was about the sort of contents of that building. This sort of rather confusing diagram is kind of our attempt to understand all the different, or to simply explain all the different stakeholders that fell into this project and what made it so rich. So the Granville was a building, yes, that had a sort of particular heritage for local people. But it was owned by Brent Council, so they had an asset that they were actually struggling to lease because it was sort of run down and it was becoming a bit of a sort of problem for them. And then we had local people who needed space to do things. There was the South Kilburn Trust, who are a charity, who run various services from some porta cabins that were sort of due to be demolished. They ran a kind of enterprise hub, which was supporting people, local entrepreneurs, to start their own business, also being run from some porta cabins that were due to be demolished. And then we had various existing users in the Granville, from a sort of children's centre and a nursery to a community kitchen. And so we needed to find a way that all these users could combine in this building and sort of do so in a way that they would support one another. And we sort of worked with the South Kilburn Trust, the charity, to secure funding from the Mayor of London for the capital works to sort of refurbish this building and bring everyone together. And really it was about those negotiation of those different users and showing that there was a long-term sort of sustainable future for this group of people in this building. So there was various iterations of consultation we went through, from sort of one-to-one drawings and masking tape and showing people models and going on visits to try and understand how we could sort of get all these different users together. What sort of felt as a kind of ideal project for an architect, in that, oh wow, great, you know, mixed use space for getting all the different members of the community together, how beautiful, was actually quite a challenge when you suddenly realize you've got the needs of sort of someone who wants to be professional and start up a business on one side, and then maybe sort of vulnerable groups on the other who need care or just need a kind of public space in the warm where they can sort of hang out for free, and sort of how those two kind of rub shoulders together and coexist in the same space. But that was sort of all the sort of challenge of the project. Basically, there was sort of a couple of simple design moves that really unlocked the building for us. I won't go into them too much because that's not really what this sort of talk is about. But there's sort of these two moves. The one was this sort of new entrance staircase that resolved access issues, but also opened up a garden that was currently underused and sort of made that connection between the interior and the exterior of the building, and sort of created this open plan space in the middle that was really created by just demolishing a lot of old partition walls. There's this really nice story about how LeShan, who run the Saucy Soccer Cafe, she was sort of making hot sauce from the porta cabins, and then we helped her to grow her business, and now she's almost the sort of front of house for the building. And then the other sort of key move of this project was about this sort of church hall that couldn't be used because residents were complaining about noise. And sort of this is where we sort of created an enterprise hub for startup businesses. And this was all really done sort of through low cost materials and by cutting a staircase through the middle of the space that linked these two floors, got rid of old partitions, and created a kind of open, social, collaborative working environment. With these sort of flexible studios that could adapt to hold different people. And there's this wonderful range of users in there now, from kind of like a card maker to a Somali women's group to a photographer, an artist, a basketball association. Downstairs there's a little music studio. There's someone who records music with local young people. There's a cake maker. It's a real kind of sort of mixed use space. But really, I guess the whole sort of the message of sort of this project, and I kind of what this quote brings nicely into focus was that it was a way of kind of taking local people on a journey, arriving in a situation where there was this amazing thriving local community, and they were doing lots of good work there, sort of kind of led by the South Kilburn Trust, this local charity. But the work they were doing was under threat because the spaces they were using were being demolished, their funding models were insecure, and it was about working with them to move them into this space and a meanwhile use, with support from the GLA, with support from Brent, as a kind of proof of concept to show that the local community deserves and is able to run a community space, and even that you know, they're able to ensure it's sort of financially sustainable. And sure enough, this meanwhile project is now being developed and taken onto a second phase, where Brent and the GLA are sort of building out sort of a whole new community centre that's been taken forward by Adam Khan. And our kind of Granville, that original church hall, is a key part of that master plan. So this project was all about that kind of financially viable journey with local people. So that was about people. Now, sort of Tahera's going to talk a little bit about place.
Yeah, so Park House, or Pegasus Life Park House, is a later living scheme. Our clients, when they first came to us, asked us to deliver high density residential development for the over 60s. And the sensitivity was that it was in a conservation area in a town centre location. I think for us, as part of the brief making and as part that we found out more about the project, it was really important, and what came about was the need to combat loneliness and to meet acute housing need for older people. So really the factor really was about the retired communities needed to downsize because they had these oversized family homes, and they need to be better located. So they were they're closer to communities and they're closer to their families. It was completed in 2019. It offered 38 later living apartments, provided communal spaces. I think what's really important about this project is, unlike the other two that we're going to describe, is about the kind of the place. The place was really important. So it was very much about user-centric design. So social value being embedded within the architecture. So spaces within the architecture and where you meet, the space that you go in between, how you encourage people that are isolated and how they can interact with each other. Fundamentally, that's where the premise of the project lay. So in this slide, it's very much about describing that it starts off from the apartment. You know, we wanted to create apartments that were open plan. The corridors were generously arranged, but also providing spaces where walls can be taken down to provide, you know, interconnecting rooms. So improving that legibility and offering flexibility for the changing needs of the over 60s. You know, as they become a little bit more frail, how can you adapt that apartment to kind of meet their needs a bit more? You know, but also in that, sorry, if you go back up the slide one more time, sorry. But also there's sort of dual aspect apartments. Every apartment was dual aspect. It also had a balcony. It provided high levels of natural light. But also the one thing that was really important was being close to people. So whilst in your apartment you had the choice of going out and being close to a park or being close to the high street, you also had the choice of retreating back and being in your home and actually viewing out, opening your balcony doors and looking out and seeing people walk by. And that in itself was that connection, that I am still connected, part of a kind of wider network community. We'll tell you the next slide, please. So also, I think, for us, it's really important that actually the kind of the journeys that you make from your apartment, from outside into your apartment, was also really important. Each house block or villa, that we call it, is serviced by a central core that has a lift and a staircase, and each of the apartments on that floor are directly accessed. There are no corridors. We try and minimize where we can. In fact, in this one, there is no corridor. We dealt with the fire through sprinklering the entire corridor. But what this allowed for is people can open their doors and come out and see each other without having to go through a series of doors to see each other. You know, you can, space generously, that you can sit down and you can have a cup of tea, you can take your chair out. And we've also provided for each of these cores kind of a light well that tries to bring in natural light. So this kind of really deep plan is is listed with these kind of roof lights to kind of encourage the space to be as usable as possible, and encourage people to come out and see each other and kind of chat and stay, I guess. In the same sort of staying on the same slide, I think each apartment is also very efficient. And the trade-off that we thought was important is that by providing an efficient plan, you could open up the ground floor of each of these villas for communal facilities. So bringing in things like, communal lounges, which is in the sort of photograph in the bottom corners, where you can do craft or have a kind of dinner with your friends that live in this villa. There's a kitchen as well that helps people, kind of brings people together. And also, I think there's a wellbeing suite, which is not within this photograph, but you can do physiotherapy and hairdressing. So it really tries to say, well, whilst your apartment's efficient, actually the generosity in where you meet each other is in the communal spaces. And the next slide. Okay. So I think for us, our client was really keen on building density into the project, and that was kind of the baseline that this conversation started. And that was, and then we fulfilled that through kind of the careful arrangement of the villa blocks. So those 3 staggered blocks allowed the massing to be broken down. We also provided articulated roof forms to build in apartments within those roof forms to break down the massing even further. But in the kind of staggering of those blocks, we will also be able to kind of provide these really interesting outdoor spaces, which was the other layer of kind of shared communal space that was really important. It's not only about having shared space internally, but also having shared space externally. So we call them the social patios, where people can come out, have a cup of tea, meet each other, but also that people between other villas can pass each other, and you're not always confined to people within your own block. You can get to know other people beyond your own block as well. So next slide. So I think also for us is important is that this specific site is located in the heart of Harpenden. So it isn't, at the bottom. If you go up one slide, Tony, I think I might describe it. In the bottom right-hand corner, in the sort of the diagram with the red box around the site, to the south is Rothamsted Park, which is kind of a historic, really enormous historic park that serves the entire Harpenden sort of town. And then to the north is the kind of town centres and the high street. We go down to the next slide. So for us, it was really important now, actually, by opening up one of those communal facilities, or one of those communal lounges, which we called, which was a community cafe, we were able to provide this link that connected the high street and the park together. So this yellow route that runs through it is actually a physical path that you walk along. You can go and have a cup of tea in the cafe, or you can go out and then walk along the path and access the park. So in that, I think it's about, for us, it was about taking advantage of the location and integrating that path into the scheme, and encouraging, kind of further encouraging those interactions, especially those incidental interactions. This idea, if we go to the next slide, this idea of a community cafe was actually born out of something that we did very early on in our project, as part of the brief making, which I described, and understanding and identifying what actually people needed. We were able to come together with a seniors club, which were located in the Harpenden site at the time, and we created a joint venture, which helped us sort of not only develop our design, understand what we needed, but also they were sort of the champions of our project. They were the ones that helped us through the kind of really quite contentious planning proposals. And in the end, actually, there was overwhelming public support at planning. And that joint venture was probably the kind of the critical thing that helped us get over the line. Next slide. And I think just sort of looking at reflection, it is an intense use of the town centre Granville site. And it does move away from those dramatic traditional models of retirement living, which outside in suburban, outside in the outskirts of suburbia. I think it's important to remind ourselves that actually, the older communities absolutely need to be embedded within our within our community. It's not about being out of sight and out of mind, it's about being visible. And the park house embeds the residents in the heart of the community, where they can best contribute to the life of the town and take advantage of proximity and key services, shops, public transport. And also they also support the local vibrancy of the high street. So they are absolutely part of being in our community, they're not. So in that quote that we've got, it's come from quite apt. So care, I would argue, is implicit in the architecture, thanks to a client that recognises that commercial success and residents' well-being go hand in hand. And an architect that in a quiet and understated way understands how architecture sits at the interface between the individual, their community, and the public as a whole. That's me.
Okay. And then I think that the third project we're going to talk about is a business park in Ryde on the Isle of Wight. And actually, you can see it's an extension to an existing business park that you can see in the foreground of this image. And our site is actually these fields that's then in the foreground of that existing business park. What I really like about this project is we're sort of working at the master plan scale. And actually, some of the things we're interested in, whether it's in Granville about that understanding, that kind of mixed use and those range of different users and how they can sort of cohabit a space for sort of each other's mutual benefit, or it's that sort of park house approach, which is really about placemaking and about thinking about routes through the project, you know, from the apartment to the town, and how those routes can create an interconnectedness and bring people together. These all come out in this business park, which is a really enjoyable opportunity for us to kind of expand our ideas into master plan. I guess the key thing with this Ryde Business Park is the Isle of Wight Council came to us as our client, and what they really needed to do is they really needed to retain youngsters on the island. Too many people were leaving the Isle of Wight to find employment elsewhere, and so they were left with the very young or they were left with the retired. So that was the kind of key brief. But really what they were imagining was a business park, sort of the typical model of the business park where you have large units, lots of car parking spaces and lots of tarmac. And we really wanted to challenge that on this site and do something different and create a different sort of workplace and business park, one that was focused on a sort of community and a sense of place. That really was led by the landscape approach and about our approach to the specific site. Excuse me, I'm taking you through our consultation slides because I find they sort of present the narrative quite well. And really what we learned about this was a landscape first led approach to the master plan. And the landscape came first really because this was the outstanding asset of the Isle of Wight, of Ryde, and of this particular site, having this amazing greenfield site on the edge of town with these wonderful views out over the Isle of Wight beyond the settlement. That was what made this site special. And so rather than seeing that as a sort of an issue, we saw that as the sort of driver for how this master plan should set out to be. So embedded within that sort of landscape first approach, we had a few principles. The first one was a kind of creating a strong sense of place. So you can see at the center of the site, we had this kind of community square, and that was about introducing a mix of different uses. So we have some housing in there, we have some retail, we have a GP surgery, a gym. And the idea was that not only the people who worked in this business park would come here, but actually it would be a sort of a resource and a place to visit for the sort of surrounding residents. The second part of that was sort of weaving in walking routes for pedestrians and cycle routes for cyclists, so that people could arrive at this business park from Ryde without using a car. And actually this business park would kind of provide the jumping point for the surrounding countryside. You know, previously, although it had been beautiful green fields, those fields were essentially inaccessible. So the idea was by creating walking routes, we were actually bringing people into this landscape. And that went hand in hand with sort of certain measures to try and reduce traffic, try and have traffic calming measures, trying to concentrate car parking in particular spaces so the rest of the site could be left open and free. And then it was also a lot about preserving the existing ecology. And that was a really enjoyable thing about this project, that actually, because these fields had never been developed before, there was already a rich ecology there of bats and newts and these ancient hedgerows that were full of wildlife, you know, and they became users of this business park as much as anyone else. And ensuring that, you know, they could remain there and wouldn't be disturbed was a key part of what we were doing. And so I kind of, that was our approach, this landscape-led approach to the business park. And then we broke it down into certain character areas, each of which kind of had its own ambitions within that overall framework of providing a connected landscape. The first I've already mentioned was this community hub, which is about this mixed use town square and bringing these different users in. And this is quite unusual for a business park. You're not used to a business park having a heart or a center. When we went and visited other business parks, the focal point would be a sort of hot dog van, and that's where everyone would come to around lunch. And we were like, well, why can't we expand that hot dog van to create a town square that is something for everyone? So that was the sort of key focal point of that. The next part was this office campus. We realized that part of preserving this ecology on the site and part of dealing with the levels and the floodplain and what's so on meant that we couldn't actually develop the whole site. The bottom of the site sort of almost had to be left on its own. It was just simply too expensive and too damaging to the environment to develop. So we came up with a model of development here that sat very lightly on the site. The car parking was pushed to one side of the hedgerow, and we had these office blocks on the others set within greenery. And the idea is that this would be the high value part of the business park. This is the sort of aspirational place that you might locate your business. And then the third and maybe most important element of the business park, and which makes up the majority of the site, as you can see from that little diagram with the yellow highlight in the top right-hand corner, was really the sort of standard different units you would expect to find, ranging from these kind of larger industrial units that were capable of taking some of the successful businesses on the Isle of Wight that are already looking to expand. There was a sort of a rotor blade manufacturer for offshore wind farms. There was various industries to do with the hovercraft. So there's quite a lot of aviation on the aviation-related industry on the Isle of Wight. It's quite interesting. And then on the other end, we had these small incubator units, which almost took what we learned from Granville, these sort of shared spaces where small businesses, wanting to try out an idea, someone who's producing some vinyls to stick on cars, someone who was sort of manufacturing bespoke office chairs, they could move into these little incubator units to try out their business. And the whole idea is that all these units were designed not only to be sympathetic to the landscape, but also to kind of encourage that collaboration between one another. So you don't just drive to your unit, park there and stay. You're actually encouraged to interact with the other businesses around you, meet them for lunch at the community hub, sort of enjoy walking that landscape. You've got time off, you need to think about ideas. And so the idea was that we were sort of bringing everyone together. And yeah, and that really is sort of the end of that case study. I think, well, Tahera and I were sort of putting this together. We were sort of reflecting. It was a really nice opportunity to reflect on our own work. That, as we've said, we have certain ambitions as architects, Tahera and I, but also as a practice to kind of unlock and embed social value, do more with the architecture we're producing to try and have a positive impact. And we were wondering about what's our role in that process? How much are we a kind of sort of passive facilitator of these projects, and how much are we sort of driving certain aspects? And it sort of, for us, it came down to this question, didn't it, Tahera, between this sort of tension and and we sort of wanted to sort of reflect with all of you, do you also experience this tension between the kind of commercial realities of our industry, sort of viability, having to, sort of meet certain commercial targets, whether it's coming from funders, whether it's to prove a model works for a community hub, whether it's to develop a master plan that's going to attract investment. There's certain commercial realities there that we need to make sure we are sort of meeting. Otherwise, these projects simply won't go ahead. But then on the other hand, there's this sort of positive social impact we want to achieve, combating loneliness, supporting a site to remain for the community rather than being developed for housing, keeping lots of hedgerows and ecology on the site when, the pressure really is just to tarmac over and sort of provide jobs. So there's that balance, and we're constantly finding we're having to sort of justify one in order to satisfy the other. So what?
Yeah.
So I think,
yeah, no, absolutely. I think the tension that you're describing is, you in order to justify to our clients, and specifically to say, actually, your social value is really important. The impact of your building, your project is really important. But the only way you can really truly justify is through demonstrating the financial benefits that your clients can achieve from it. And so that's the best way you can sell to your client. You should do this. You should listen and really do these engagements, or embed the community as part of the brief. But I think it's not always always fine. The tension is it's not all clients are not always forthcoming with that first. The first thing is it a viable project? Can we make money? Can this work? Before it is this going to be is this going to impact our community? Is this going to be a positive impact towards the community? Are they going to benefit something from it? And I think that we always find our role has meant that we've had to try and balance that tension, and we balance that tension by demonstrating to our clients, the best way you can do this is because you'll get this kind of value out of it. This is kind of and usually it's a monetary value. So I wonder where we sit. It's like what Tony was saying. Do clients have to go through the process of learning the value of building in social value into your project, and then the next project they come along, they actually understand the value of it and sort of learn from it? Or is it that we're always going to be in this position where we're balancing that tension because it's just the reality? But
we're like reflecting on those projects to here, aren't we? We were talking about the journey sort of on each of those. Like in each of those at the beginning of the journey, there was a sort of need to justify. On Park House, it was about a client who wanted to kind of maximize the development value of that site. So they wanted higher densities, but actually out of those higher densities, we felt we were able to achieve some of our aims in terms of combating loneliness and actually creating a more connected community. On the Isle of Wight, they just needed to provide jobs, but we found that in producing jobs, there were all sorts of other benefits that came from looking at that site more widely. I mean, obviously the Granville one maybe is the one that most explicitly set out with kind of social aims, but there was still that real tension between a council who was undertaking or facilitating massive amounts of development in South Kilburn, and making sort of some good profits from a lot of housing, and they had to be given justification. No, this site is not about development for housing. This site is about preserving something for the community, and there's a financial case for doing so. So I guess
I wonder, Tony, that in what you're saying, that actually, for example, Park House, if there wasn't an agenda to try and kind of be socially responsive, what kind of project would that actually be if that layer of briefing wasn't included? Would Park House be what it is, or would it be something a little bit more, kind of these big blocks that are in the middle of the landscape? What would that look like? It's really hard to know, but we feel like that actually bringing that layer of, the aim of being socially responsive, we think makes a better, not necessarily always the kind of most aesthetic architecture, but actually better architecture. Don't know.
That makes me full circle about, at the beginning we were talking a little bit about sort of what motivates us, and you wonder like, well, maybe that is our role. If you reflect on those projects, Park House would have been a high density block of flats. And it is a high density block of flats. Ryde Nicholson would have been a tarmac business park, or maybe wouldn't have got planning permission because of the damage to the ecology, and it would have been an undeveloped site, so there would have been no jobs. I mean, you sort of reflect on what would these projects been without us, and you start to wonder, back to this role of the architect thing, is that a space as architects we should be claiming that actually, it really is up to us to champion the wider benefits, as the Social Value Act calls them, champion the wider benefits of development, because if we don't do it, no one else will. I don't know, I guess maybe this is the bit where we should stop talking with each other and Jason should open it up. What do you think, Jason?
Tony, if you want to stop sharing a screen, that way it's a bit more inviting, I think, to other people as well. So yeah, I think you've ignited kind of interesting conversation there, and I just remind people again, like, if you have any questions, unmute or put them in the chat and I can definitely read them out, although I appreciate it takes a while for them to formulate in your mind, so I've always got a few. Where were we? Is it the architect's role to kind of dictate that? I think going back to that, I was going to ask how you involve stakeholders, particularly with well, I guess all of the projects. Who was bringing them to the table? Is that you? Have you sought them out? Have they come to you from the developer, from the client? Is it something that came naturally from the council? Because they're all really important, and they are kind of key to extracting that social value and ensuring it achieves something. But I was just curious as to how you get them involved and how essentially you enhance that dialogue.
Yeah, it's interesting, Tahera, isn't it? Because actually, I just reflecting on the talk we've just given. I guess the talk was very much a product of the dilemma we're talking about. This feeling of the need to justify ourselves. So actually, when we described those 3 projects to you, we were talking very much in terms of the design moves we made in order to demonstrate value. You can always take out social from that just to demonstrate value. I guess we could have given a different talk about how we engaged local people or engaged stakeholders in each of those projects in order to ensure they are embedded. I guess maybe that's just one element of achieving social value is about taking people along in the journey. And then for me, I guess with sort of engagement and sort of consultation, co-design, these different words for sort of slightly different sort of variations of the same thing. It's a really bespoke process that needs to be designed to suit the particular project you're working on and the particular environment you're in. So Granville was really heavy on engagement, but actually it was a lot to do with just being available and having one-to-one conversations and just sort of slowly that negotiation process of you're all moving in together and we can make this work. Well, actually, weirdly, Tahera, go.
On Park House, I have to admit, I don't think there was any sort of appreciation that engaging with users are, and primarily because there wasn't really a user, because it was a new building. But actually, engaging with the community was really important. I think it was definitely something that we would have brought to the table, and I think it wasn't that. I think it was from the developer's point of view. I think the benefit they saw from it was actually engaging with the community meant that we could de-risk our planning rather than actually, potentially this could mean something that could be greater. And I think as the process went along, not only did you get buy-in from the community, you got buy-in from your client as well. So I do think it's I think we feel that having done so many versions of these consultations, I think there is a process that we as facilitators have to take everyone on the journey. It's not entirely like sometimes some clients absolutely know they want to do it, some clients don't. And
it's interesting how we both respond to that question, Tahera, because like some of the background people won't be aware of is that Tahera, I feel, has had more dealing with sort of private clients, while my dealings have been more actually with local authority clients. So even in the answer to that question, Tahera, you were again felt like you were putting it back to the need to justify why you were doing things, which is which is one of the things that came out of this talk when we were putting it together, which is why it was nice to do things as a pair.
I can see Quincy's raised his hand. So Quincy, do you want to go far away?
Hi, Tony and Tahera. Yes, my question, I quite like the word facilitator that Tahera just used. And I think sometimes the architect needs to think of it as not necessarily always needing a design solution, but the solution could be like putting someone in contact with someone else, and then that kind of unlocks the project. And it might not necessarily mean that your role is as meaningful as you probably would have set out from the beginning, but you're doing something in a different way, which helps drive the project along.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting, Christy. I mean, that reflects on it. There's a project we're working on at the moment for the Ebbsfleet Development Corporation, which is like kind of looking at the communal space planned for the garden city. They're bringing forward a massive garden city, loads of housing is coming forward, but who's thinking about the spaces that people use when they're not in their houses? And actually in this project, it's one of those things where we're not even sure what the client wanted when they commissioned us, but they were very keen it would be architect-led, and they said they could have gone with a placemaking consultant. And actually what we've ended up doing has been a lot to do with like marketing and making connections and just sifting through all the people that have been involved in conversations about the garden city for the last, well, it's been going on since I was born, basically, the idea that we were building a new garden city in Kent. And saying, well, who are the people who are interested in sort of running or supporting or enabling community facilities in the garden city, and let's get them all into a room and talking to the development corporation. you know, and it's been quite weird sometimes not designing anything and really just presenting and organizing information. But that has felt like our role.
I think also the added benefit is we are experts in architecture and buildings. You know, that's the layer, that the extra value that we can bring in as being a facilitator, even if it's that making connections. But I guess that value, you know, you won't get in another scenario if another person facilitated. I think, you know, specifically about spaces, we get it. I think that's probably, you know, often that we put ourselves as architects first and facilitators next. And I feel like it's almost like we are in what we're doing currently. It feels like we're facilitators first and then architects as an added value sometimes.
And I think it might be stronger because you're not always thinking about the building from the get-go. It's more about the output, or like what the ambition is from the beginning, rather than, oh, it needs to be X number of square meters or provide these amount of flats. It's less about the constraints,
exactly.
rather than
what
you want to achieve.
Yeah, what's the impact? Your objective starts off with, what is my impact? What do I want to get out of it? And, you know, the means to an end is the architecture that takes you to that.
Should we be pushing councils to demand more from kind of these such programs? At the moment, it's the architect that's kind of not dictating, but facilitating such things. But I wonder if it is something we should be demanding it's other stakeholders to kind of be more forthright in.
I think one of the interesting things about that is like I am beginning to notice, I'm sure other people are, filtering through council procurement, this need to deliver social value. You know, it used to be like, it was actually quite nice, like 2 or 3 years ago when it started appearing. You are asked to demonstrate you would be delivering social value, and they would give you a kind of 5-10% score for it. But it was kind of up to you to propose something, and it felt quite creative. We had some projects where we got to do quite exciting things because we were thinking, well, what is social value for this project? But actually, increasingly, it seems to be going in the direction of kind of toolkits and like demonstrating figures that can demonstrate value, which I feel closes down a lot of the opportunity to sort of really support people, because as we said, every place is specific, every group of people have different needs, and so you end up with like, oh, we'll do X number of apprenticeships, or we will hold a workshop to paint our hoarding, and I just think it's a really challenging, Jason, because you're right, we can't just leave it up to the architect to champion these things, and the council should be demanding and asking for it. But in a kind of environment in which everything needs to be stacked up against each other, how do we measure this value? And then as soon as we start having this conversation about measuring social value, I worry that the sort of creativity and site specificity gets lost. That's a horrible word.
Yeah, I think absolutely I think wider stakeholders do understand the value of kind of embedding social value in it, in their project. I just think it's perhaps the method and how it's being measured is kind of the problem, you know. And I think Tony's right. It's about, you know, it shouldn't be every project is bespoke. You cannot put one blanket toolkit for every single project, and projects are not measured on toolkits. Projects are measured on outcome, you know, and every project has its own outcome. And I don't necessarily, I think what I'm saying is, I think stakeholders are increasingly engaged, but I think they're engaged in a way that provides something tangible. And I think what we're saying is sometimes social value is intangible, and that's what you have to sign up for. That's the bit where we should be demanding, you know, councils to be able to kind of appreciate more.
I was trying to hear, I mean, that isn't necessarily our question, but that is another question. Is there anyone here who could shed light on that, like from a local authority, who, you know, are you involved with commissioning projects, and are you asking for social value, and what are the kind of responses that you're getting that you're pleased with? I mean, I know 1 or 2 people on that participant list who are working in local authorities, so I'm wondering whether any one of them might want to chip in with their thoughts on that.
While that stews in their mind, I'm going to read out a question from Kat, who says, you mentioned evidencing your designs at the beginning. Could you talk about what evidence you used and compiled for one of these projects, and how it influenced the design and potentially discussions with the client?
I guess that's the problem of how we evidence it. I mean, it took different forms in different projects, and I guess that's going to pull us back in the direction of financial viability, isn't it? Because that's often the evidence we're required to provide as you move through the various stages of the project. You know, I'm thinking specifically about sort of both the Granville and Ride Nicholson on that. You know, the viability and the business case on both of those was really carefully scrutinized to, you know, to ensure that it basically was sustainable. How is it on Park House, Tahera?
About evidence of social value. So I missed the question. I think it was.
You mentioned evidencing your designs at the beginning. Could you talk about what evidence you used and compiled for projects?
I think for us, it's definitely, because I think every project, particularly Park House, I think every project is really unique. So you can't sort of have a blanket rule for every single project and measure against a singular thing. I think I think we always had, the way we evidenced it was, well, we have an agenda. We want to combat loneliness. And I think the way we always went back, I think for Park House, we went back and interviewed our users. And we asked those questions about, you know, tell us about, you know, what your life was like before, what you're currently, you know, what improvements have made in your, what improvements have you made in your life now? You know, and I think it was documented through interviews, documented through videoing. I think that for us was a way of trying to kind of understand the nuances of impact. And that's the way we've evidenced it on Park House. So I don't know, I mean, and I feel like there's different ways that you would do things differently to other projects, but the idea of going back to your projects and talking to those people that are using it is probably one way that we've done it so far. Really agree, Tony. There's kind of,
yeah, I mean, that whole thing of returning to a project sort of is again another interesting point where because you sort of phrase it a bit different here, but the idea that the building sort of is, or what Quincy says, whether you have a building or not, it's like the building is one of the tools in your arsenal to sort of achieve a certain impact with your project. So the idea that sort of a project's life cycle goes beyond that of the building, and that you would go back and reflect is sort of really, really important. And I think that was again another thing that was implicit in the Granville because it was a meanwhile project. But this idea that sort of having delivered it, we then needed to sort of do some hold handing as people moved into the building for them to sort of get best use out of the spaces. So therefore, a year down the line, they could do their impact report, hand it over to the council, and say, look, we're deserving of leasing this building in the long term. Was sort of kind of another part of reflecting on the building afterwards. Important.
I can see that Bianca's raised her hand. So Bianca, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hello, long time no see. It's been 5 years or so. This is just regarding the previous question that you had asked, Tony. So I've been a social value consultant within my sustainability engineering career for the last year or so, and I work with some, although I don't work for a local council, I've been working on some local council projects in London, and I just wanted to share a couple anecdotes about what I've learned in terms of the dichotomy between measurement frameworks and how that kind of kills the creativity of a project, but what in some sense how it can provide value to the conversation that you have with the local council or with clients in general. So I found that particularly even like referring to best practice guidance like UKGBC social value guidance, I think what it provides the most value for is providing documentation that gives you an outline for the processes in place. So identifying key stakeholders, engaging with key stakeholders, defining outcomes, which kinds of KPIs are going to be achieving those outcomes. And I think within that space, then that's where architects come in and any other members of the design team, where there is creativity in that space and how to achieve those outcomes. But I think the whole and I think also things like the TOMS framework or HACT, which monetize social value, which I don't like monetizing social value because I think it's way too complicated to try to monetize it. But what it does do is create a common language that developers and councils understand. You know, money is something, you know, they're used to talking about. And so what I find I do in my strategies is I present social value as something where some things are easily monetized. So how much money gets spent on local MSMEs and supply chains? Like, where does the money that they were going to spend in the first place, when it gets diverted, you can kind of try to monetize that using things like the TOMS framework. But then you have categories which aren't quantifiable. They're more qualitative outcomes. They're more outcomes that are site specific, contextual to the project and to the stakeholder engagement that was carried out towards the beginning and the outcomes that need to come out of that. So I think, just to recap all of that, I think it's quite helpful when having these discussions that you have the things that you can monetize and that can be attributed to each project, because each project will have supply chain expenditure, whether it's tiny or enormous, it's refurb, you know, there will be some kind of expenditure. There will be some kind of maintenance. And if you outline that that can be sourced locally, you can already define, you know, that's that kind of social value. So I find there are common themes between each kind of project that regardless, you can unlock social value from those things. And then you have the more creative, the more exciting stuff that we like to focus on, but we don't tell them that. they can look at the whole holistic thing. And by understanding part of it, because it's been talked about as money, they can embrace the thing as a whole, because they understand that there are things that they understand and there are things that they don't, but it's okay, the design team has that covered. Sorry about the ramble, but hopefully that made a bit of sense.
No, I totally agree with that. That's a good summary for what we should do. Could you just write that down in an email for me, Bianca? That feels ideal. I think I'm going to do that because I think we do. Yeah, like we definitely. I think it's quite interesting the way you separated it, because I guess we've sort of, with this weird, like, the use of words, but we've sort of slightly deviated from talking about social value to talking about social impact recently because of this sort of qualitative quantitative thing. And I guess what we've sort of felt is that actually the sort of qualitative stuff you can do, where there's creativity and you're getting really site specific, we feel that's where we can have the greatest impact. But it's not necessarily so easy to demonstrate the value, the sort of quantitative stuff there. So I guess, maybe it does make me reflect that maybe instead of sort of riling against the quantitative stuff and the value, and as you say, you mentioned TOMS and Hack and the sort of toolkits, maybe you're right. Maybe we need, I quite like that you need to be a bit clearer in your mind. I'm just summarizing what you said, Bianca, that actually, like, what are the things that can fall into those toolkits? But then let's also be very explicit about leaving space for the things that don't fall in with that toolkit. And it's not sort of a one approach works. Actually, we need both. And I really like what you said about, actually, if you can do the quantitative stuff quantitative stuff, should be easy. So if you can do that clearly, you build the confidence in your sort of client base, your financial backers, that they should also leave you space to do the qualitative. So yeah,
I think also,
really good.
Tony, I think the challenge for us is joining those bits up successfully. And I think some people that might do it, and Bianca, I think you probably demonstrated that you do it very successfully, but I reckon that more people need to understand that it's a holistic picture and it's not entirely sort of one or the other, and there needs to be a greater kind of ambition to try and join those two bits of things up together to be one thing rather than two separate things. I think that's really important, and that's probably the challenge that we have at the moment.
I was going to say, I want to get to Peter and Jack's question in a bit, but I can see Quincy's raised his hand again. So go ahead, Quincy.
It was just a quick follow-up after what Bianca said, because Tony and I have been speaking about this separately, but we were talking about understanding who the value is relevant to and which parts of the stakeholder group will kind of capitalize or make the most on the value that we're adding to the project. So I guess for my LSA manual, we were talking about who the value is relevant to, and we kind of create this matrix of plotting it out against a series of categories. And I guess that's sort of the quantifying method, trying to capture how it helps in a certain way. But I think it's kind of a combination of what Bianca was saying, kind of what I was looking at before, because there are bits where things can be monetized, but ultimately the bits that are the most impactful can't be broken down into, it's going to cost £10 a square meter to do this. And I think it's about potentially showing the stakeholders how valuable something is, like potentially the users rather than the client, and letting the user base, the people that are going to be ultimately filling this space, sell that back to the client. Let them talk about, oh, well, you can use this space for your judo class on a Thursday evening, and let them tell the client and let them show the need and the desire for it. And then it doesn't come from someone who's kind of outside that space.
That's really important. I think that's where, because I think empowering a community is all part of that. You know, I want to be able to have a social impact on my project. I want to be able to be socially responsive, is empowering that community. And sometimes those voices don't know if they can or can't. And perhaps, like you were saying before, that being that facilitator is not necessarily saying, I'm telling you this is what you should be doing, but saying, look, here, community, you've got a voice now, say what you want. You know, it's about empowering, so that actually that continues beyond the project, that continues afterwards, and that dialogue remains between the client and the user, you know, and that we can step away and not have to be the mediators all the time. I think that's really
exactly
important.
Okay, I've got technically 3 minutes, but we might go a bit over. I'm gonna ask Jack's question. Jack says, thank you so much for the really fascinating talk. I was wondering, what kind of construction methods did you use to ensure the wildlife wasn't impacted? I presume this is for Ride Nicholson.
Well, it's still only at outline master plan stage. Yeah. So I guess what we were looking at was embedding some ideas into our design code. The name so slipped me. Our design code, to make sure that was picked up at latter stages. I mean, to be honest, it was a lot about what we didn't do rather than what we did do. You know, we realized that actually what was important on this site was to tread lightly on it and to be very sensitive about the areas we were developing and the areas we weren't developing. Actually, light played a really big factor in this, interestingly. It was important that the areas we weren't developing weren't negatively impacted by too much lighting that would sort of completely change the day cycle of the habitat that was there. So a lot of effort actually went into the lighting in the design code. In terms of the construction, actually, we needed to be, back to economics, we needed to be very mindful of the commercial realities on the Isle of Wight, and that actually the kind of the profit margins there, whatever the word is, aren't really there to do anything too spectacular. So it was about sort of low cost, robust, reusable materials, really than about sort of trying to encourage too clever construction techniques. I mean, there were certain things about, you know, about embedding solar PV in there and about trying to get as much energy generation on the site as possible from the site. There was a lot to do with the sort of water management of the site as well. And those sort of ponds at the bottom that were flooded, they were about creating an ecological habitat, yes, but they're also about managing water flow. So there was stuff to do with the infrastructure, but most of it was to do about what we didn't develop in terms of the actual building fabrics. There were things that we encouraged. Obviously, we were sort of pushing towards, you know, wanting to encourage CLT, wanting to encourage low carbon materials, but ultimately the viability there meant that and the stage of the project meant that that was left fairly open.
Sure, thank you. I don't know. Another question from Peter, and they ask, how successful were your solutions to Park House? I've worked in homes for different communities, Caribbean, White English, Vietnamese, etc., and all use their spaces in a different way.
So I think as a specific user group, being over 60, it was really important that being close to amenities is really important. So first move was locating it in a town centre location that actually the walking distance was really short. You know, you don't necessarily have to wait for a bus every, that runs once a day. If you're on the kind of outskirts, or you have to wait for a bus that someone takes you there, you can just walk over. So the proximity of the high street was maybe about a 10-minute walk, if not less. So that was one of the solutions, kind of just the location. And I think also the other types of solutions specific to the user group was to be able to have spaces. I mean, accessibility thing, providing. So apologies about the noise. My son is at home. Providing accessible levels everywhere. So you have a lift that takes you to spaces, but also you have the option of, I want to take a staircase as well. But I think that idea that solutions like providing community cafe, that was, you are not this gated community that doesn't allow for, members of the public to be part of your community. You do have a space that everyone can come together in. So that idea of tackling kind of loneliness is sort of embedded even within the kind of common spaces that we've got, that we provided. So I don't know if that answered some of the questions.
I hope it does for Peter. I'm conscious of time. It's 2:01, and this is usually people's lunch hour, so I might nip it up there. But I just wanted to say massive thank you to really really engaging audience. So thank you for all of those who came. But obviously, of course, a massive thank you to Tony and Tahera for your time today. Been fascinating CPD. And Peter says thank you. So I think that might answer the question. So on that note, I'm going to end the call. But we do have CPD coming up next week. Do stay tuned. But once again, thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of the week.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for giving up your time to sort of listen to us. Really appreciate it, and good to have a conversation about these problems we're battling with, especially since Bianca's solved them.